Athanasius Kircher on Mercury Trismegistus. Antiquity has counted 3 Mercuries. The first was thought to have been the son of Caelus and Hemera, that is, a son of God. The second, born of the father Liber and Proserpine. The third, of Jove and Maia, to which some others add a fourth, born of Jove and Selene. A fifth is cited by Gaius Cottus, the pontiff, as well as by Cicero, and he says it was this one who was the killer of Argus. Hence he is called Argophontes, because of whose murder, committed by command of Jupiter, in order to free Io, the daughter of Inachus, who had been changed into a cow, from the custody of Argus, the son of Actaeon. Because of his murder, Mercury was forced to flee Greece with Io. And Macrobrius interprets this fantastic narrative. The field, so he says, is as the orb of fixed stars, and Mercury is the sun, at whose rising Argus is interred. That is to say, the other stars vanish at its intense light. Therefore Mercury, whose fame in astronomy is visible everywhere, upon his coming into Egypt, he was honored by all because of his learning, his knowledge of literature, and his skill in politics. For he gave laws to the Egyptians, and prescribed for them a peaceful way of living, for the preservation of their society and of human life. He also commanded the rites of sacred scriptures, and put them into Egyptian writing. And he instituted among them a college of priests, each of whom still worshipped his own native gods, with special ceremonies, offering them sacrifices according to the seasons of the year. And so, the monuments of the Greeks relate as much to us, as well as the writings of Cicero and Clement and Arnobius and others. Sanchoniaton of Berythius, who lived shortly after the time of Moses, wrote a history of the Phoenicians that is related to us by Diodorus, who reports that Mercury was called Tautus among the Phoenicians and Thoth among the Egyptians, and that this Thoth was the scribe of Saturn, and was counted among the gods, that he invented letters. He was the first to observe many things concerning the honors of the gods, including their sacred rites, astrology, music, and nature. That he instituted government, or the gymnasium, and the chorus among them. He invented the lyre, and that because of the eloquence with which he taught, he was called by the Greeks Hermio, which means interpreter. But whether or not this Hermes, as Diodorus says, who was one of the counselors of Osiris and Isis, is the same man as who killed Argus, we shall see if we can affirm or deny it by any indication or testimony of antiquity. If, however, Diodorus and others are to be believed, I would say that Orpheus first, and then other Greeks, transferred to their own the things that belonged to the Egyptians, which Strabo also admits in his 17th book, and therefore I am inclined to agree with the opinion of Plato, that the invention of letters should be attributed not to Mercury, the slayer of Argus, but to Tautus, the Egyptian, as we shall demonstrate in detail in the following. And so, now, whether this Tautus, or Hermes, the inventor of letters, was the same as Mercury Trismegistus, about whom we are disputing, this can be called into doubt. Certainly, this Mercury was living in the time of Osiris and Isis, and Diodorus demonstrates this by inscription carved onto the tomb of Isis. It says, "I, Isis, am queen of all of these regions, instructed myself in the chorus by Hermes." And as well in the sacred writings of Hermes, the sacred Hermetic book, where there is a conversation between Isis and her son Horus. Much mention is made of Hermes, where he often calls him the mind, and he sometimes imagines God, the prince of the universe, to be speaking with Hermes, calling him the soul of his soul, and assigning to him the formation of men. The father of all counselors, and the thrice-great master, Hermes. From which light it might seem more clear that this Hermes, who had been the counselor of Isis, was that same Trismegistus. But since Trismegistus himself admits in his dialogues that there was another before him of the same name, we cannot say for certain that they are one and the same person. But in order that the full truth may be known by parts, let us now reveal at length what the Hebrews, Chaldeans, Syrians, Arabs, and Egyptians thought of the first and second Hermes. There is indeed a most ancient commentary at Rome in the College of Neophytes called the House of Melchizedek, wherein treats of the life, the manners, and the origin of Melchizedek, king of Salem, and also makes frequent mention of our Hermes, who is called either Idaris or Adaris, and also thinks him to have been multiple. Thusly, it says the first Hermes, or Adris, was Enoch, son of Jared, and him to have been the inventor of letters and of all things necessary for the preservation of human life, an excellent worshipper of justice and piety, the first assessor of the true faith in God and the worship of the divine, who, because of his virtues and works pleasing to the Most High God, was raptured and walked with God before the time that was predetermined for the common condition of mortals, leaving a perpetual memory of the admirable works done by him, so that those descendants of Noah who were seen to do wonders were called variously Adris. But I shall quote the very words themselves. Now Enoch was named Adris, and after him another Adris, whose name in the foreign tongue was Hermes, because he was the first to establish schools, in which he taught the sciences handed down to him from the protoplast, Adam, and his son Seth. He himself was the inventor of letters and mathematical arts. He taught laws, and the discipline of living well, and divine worship. And therefore the Lord took him away, and he walked with God in the Garden of Eden. And hence it came to pass that all who were distinguished in the world by sciences and the knowledge of secret art from the later times were all called Adris, that is, investigators of the hidden. Supposing that such a Hermes was Melchizedek, descended from the Canaanite race, who, because of his supreme wisdom and knowledge of divine things, became a public instructor of divine law and a presbyter of the sacred scriptures, I also subjoin the words, "And Melchizedek was another of these Adrises, king of Salem, from the house of Canaan. And he was a priest of the Most High God, and according to the Babylonian Targum, a minister before the Lord God Most High. Or, as the Syriac beautifully illustrates, he was a most religious priest of high God. And all that our commentary has mentioned up to this point agrees completely with the traditions of the Arabs, for they also think Hermes to have been Enoch, whom they also call Idris. And most clearly, above all others, in Al-Kandi, in Jalal-Din, the Arab author, in his chapter on the wisdom of Egypt, he says, "In the time of Abraham there was in Egypt Hermes, himself the second Idris, and himself Trismegistus, because he was a prophet, a king, and a wise man or philosopher. And it was he who taught the science of metallurgy, the practice of alchemy, astrology, magic, spiritual science, apoltalismatics or amuletry, and the secrets of nature, from whom later Pythagoras, Empedocles, Archelaus, the priest, Socrates, the praetor, Plato, the philosopher and politician, and Aristotle, the metaphysician, and all the rest of the astrologers took their lessons." Salamis, the Arab, says similar things in a book he calls the Garden of Wonders, which we have quoted elsewhere at length. Enoch was therefore the first to be called Adris, but the first after the flood was Hermes, the second after Enoch, who spoke many things wisely about God. Mor Isaac, in his Syriac philosophical discussion, which I have right here in front of me, makes also Hermes, whom he calls Jophanith, makes him the author of all astronomy, and describes its origin. Having thus duly stated these things, I say first that all the wisdom of the Egyptians had its beginning from Enoch before the flood, for he was the true one, who, before all others, having been instructed by the protoplast himself, had absorbed the true knowledge of divinity, and had handed them on to his posterity. And he was so great not only because of his admirable wisdom and the invention of things necessary for the human race, but also because of the impenetrable rapture of his name taken from this world, that many of his posterity proposed him too to be worshipped as a certain deity. Hence, it is probable, as the Arabs relate, that before the flood, Ham learned not only the wicked arts of exotic and most curious things from the Cainites, the followers of Cain, as had been thought likely before, but also of the sciences of God and angels, and the arcane, the arcana, finally of nature. He learned these things from Enoch, son of Methuselah himself, the heir of his paternal traditions, and that he created a law that was completely degenerate from his paternal tradition by mixing the lawful arts with the unlawful, which then a certain Trismegistus, descended from the Canaanite stock of Ham, separated the lawful from the unlawful, and reduced it to a better law, more in conformity with divine religion, as much as was permitted to an ethnic philosopher, supported only by the light of nature, in such a depravity of things, which indeed that true and so much celebrated by the authors was, according to Hermes Trismegistus, and shall be proven below. It is probable that Hermes Trismegistus was called because of the similarity and a certain analogy of the works of a former Hermes Trismegistus, whom the Arabs called Idris, and the Hebrews Enoch, whom the Arabs also called Trismegistus because of three notable prerogatives. First, because he was a priest of God, and the first to show the just ways of the Lord to the perverse mortals. Second, because of his supreme expertise in natural things, which he strove to help the necessities of human affairs in every way with his inventions, since he knew that no republic could long exist without laws and regulations. And third, he was also called the greatest because of the culture of civil life and the law, the conditions which are like a certain salt necessary for the preservation of society. Moreover, Enoch, the first Hermes, was the first after the sons of Seth to have cultivated astronomy, to have taught the system of time and years, from whose monuments, left to the next world, the second Adris, or our Hermes, derived his principles of the division of time, and transmitted them to posterity, as the Egyptians and Arabs believe. For the more arcane astrologers of the Egyptians hold it certain that the civil year of the Egyptians was divided into as many days as the first Adris lived among men. For the Holy Scriptures as well expressly state that when he lived 365 years, as many days as the civil year of the Egyptians had. Thus, in the 23rd verse of the 5th chapter of Genesis, it reads, "And all the days of Enoch were 365 years." Since Adris taught the Egyptians after this same division of the year, as we have shown in detail in our Astronomy of the Egyptians, it is possible that he understood this form from the monuments of the former Hermes, and communicated to the later world through Ham. Since, therefore, Adris did not know the years of his life were occupied by mystery, it is probable that from him came the hieromantic arcana of the Egyptians concerning the revolution of the world, namely, that the celestial gods seem to change their stations in the great arc of the sky every 100 years, and after completing a great circuit of 36,500 years, everything is restored to its first state. Which details Plato also supported, certainly, while the circle of Polygenesias of old age, which we still to this day call the Platonic year, is defined by the learned as a certain number of multiple years. For since they observed that the firmament completes 1 minute of a great circle, that is, of the zodiac, about every 100 years, this, multiplied by 360, will give 36,000. To which, if you add the 5 additional intervening days, epagamenus, means newlywed days. If you add the 5 intervening days onto this, and then multiply by 100, you will have 36,500 years. Being the completion of all things, the number of the Great Jubilee and the return of the monad back from the multitude, that is, to the original state of things, as thought Plato. Having been taught this by the Egyptians, who speculated the mystical number of years from the life of Idris, which things then some of the more recent ones have followed in the revolution of the firmament. But see now what curious things about these we have already handed down in our hieroglyphic astronomical work. Therefore, given such things, in considering how great Enoch was, it is considerably likely that his descendants, excited by his example and vying for the fame from the greatness of his works, each sought for themselves the name of Osiris, or Idris, the thrice greatest, that is, the wisdom of the highest things. And among the rest of them, Ham, tainted by this stain of ambition, triumphed over the other Noemic sons, with the title of so splendid a name. And certainly there are not lacking those most lucid traces of this assertion, so that I may boldly infer that the first and most ancient of the Trismegisti was Enoch, as the Arabs hold it. Meanwhile, Ham, whom we might also confuse with Zoroaster, as both names were being tossed about quite a bit, claimed the ambitious title of Adris for himself, either through pride or extreme insolence. But Thautus, who came from the progeny of Ham, was namely the true Mercury Trismegistus, of whom we are discussing, and was considered by common consent of all to be the second Hermes, or Adris, with Ham only trumpeting this title of this name for his own ambition and insolence. But lest I should seem to have asserted anything solely by my own conjectural genius, I have thus carefully considered the reasons for this assertion to be verified from the authors themselves. And first, in Diodorus, in his first book, he expressly relates that Mercury was a scribe, a notary of the sacred, or one of the counselors of Osiris. He says, "Whence Hermes, that is the interpreter, is called the announcer. Finally, he was the notary of Osiris, of Osiris's sacred matters, with whom he communicated all things, and whose advice he frequently used." Moreover, at which time after the flood our Mercury lived, the authors give dubious accounts. Some of the more recent ones testify that he flourished 21 years before the law of Moses was given in the desert, as well as some wrongly think that Hermes was synonymous with Moses. For it was received among the ancients that this Mercury ought to be called thrice greatest, because, according to the ancient manners of the Egyptians, he was called to the priesthood by the greatest philosopher, and was called, later words, raised up to the kingship by the greatest priest, and consequently he obtained power over the Egyptians. And it is evident that he founded among them the beginnings of letters or sacred scripture. Truly, he could not have been the author of letters without preceding the time of Moses, for the scriptures themselves testify that Moses was imbued in his cradle with all the learning of the Egyptians, which is difficult to believe without letters already well established. Nor, moreover, could he have succeeded in the empire of the Egyptians, since he lived properly under the dynasty of the gods, which far preceded the dynasty of the pharaohs and shepherds, as will be stated a little later. Meanwhile, moreover, since other rulers of the Egyptians are listed in the histories before and after Moses, it appears necessary that Trismegistus had previously held the kingdom, for otherwise Mercury would not, as has been proven above, be said to be the son of Saturn and his scribe, as he professes in the 10th chapter. It must therefore be said that he flourished about the time of Abraham himself, for Suidas relates that he lived before Pharaoh himself, for that Pharaoh was the king of Egypt, who gave his name to those who followed. Suidas also mentions. Neither could he have been one of the pharaohs, as almost all the records of the scriptures contradict, nor to have come after them, unless we want to assert that he was younger than Moses, which is repugnant to common tradition. It remains, therefore, that he must have lived before the pharaohs, and consequently around the time of Abraham, when the first foundations of the pharaonic empire were being laid, as we have shown more fully in our chronology in Oedipus. But this opinion of ours is supported by the traditions of the Orientals, who everywhere confuse him with Misraim, the son of Ham, as narrated by both the Arabs, whom we have cited above, and by Al-Kandi and Atlifasi in Gel al-Din in these words. Idris himself Misraim, son of Beether, the son of Ham, the son of Noah. And the same author, as above, explains the matter more clearly. At the time of Abraham, Hermes was in Egypt, himself the second Adris, and the rest that follow, which confusion arose from the fact that each one of the descendants of Ham assumed for themselves the ambitious titles of this kind. If, however, some, like Eusebius, suppose that he lived a little bit before Moses, I will not easily contradict a man of so great authority. For it could have happened that at this time there was another with the name Hermes, or as the Hebrews in the Zohar suggest, Jethro, the son-in-law of Moses, a man of illustrious wisdom. But I can hardly be led to believe it true that this Trismegistus was the first founder of Egyptian science, since we have already shown at length that this science flourished in Egypt long before the time of Moses. Therefore, our Hermes, the first founder of Egyptian wisdom, could not have lived at any other time than that which we have shown. For it is probable that at the same time Ham, Cus, Canaan, Misraim, and the other descendants of Zoroaster, whom our Hermes was the great-grandson, the grandson, great-grandson, and great-great-grandson, namely, at that former time the kingdom of the gods, of which he himself was accounted to be one, flourished, which we accept as more true than any other opinions, and more in harmony with all other histories, and that he is the same in Egypt as who is called Thoth, Thauti, Adris, or Saturn. In Babylonia and among the Chaldees, Zoroasters, multiple Zoroasters were called, from whom all afterwards famous for their knowledge of celestial matters and for the glory of their inventions. And it was this unique variety and multitude of equivocal names that's become the cause of so many controversies among historians and chroniclers. Now, concerning the years in which our Hermes lived, I find no less controversy among the authors. There are those who believe him to have lived with Noah, and to have come to Italy under the same leader, as exists in the Alexandrian Chronicle, in which we will cite what follows. But all of those who subscribe to this opinion think Noah to have died in the 50th year from the birth of Abraham. But each opinion together, along with those we will transmit about Trismegistus, can maintain its own authority. I suppose, then, first of all, that those Noemic patriarchs, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their descendants were of very long life, so much so that some of them can be shown from the sacred scriptures to have reached the very times of Joseph. That our age and Hermes approached is clearly demonstrated from his deeds. When some think him to have lived 180 years, as Roselius, the commentator on Trismegistus, thinks, but Bussard, in his Mercury Trismegistus, thinks that he lived 190. Some, confusing Trismegistus with Zoroaster, say that he lived for 100 years in the desert, occupied in contemplation of things, and that he later lived the same number of years educating the human race, such as Xanthus the Lydian. Others think that he lived as many years as the previous Hermes before the flood, whom we called Enoch, namely 365. Thus Abin Vassia, on the agriculture of the Egyptians, states, "And the years were the days of Hermes, himself the second Adris, 365 years, to which equaled the years of the time of Enoch, himself the first Adris." This opinion, bulging with mystical arguments, was received all the more willingly by the Egyptians, because they believed more superstitiously that the soul of the former Hermes, that is, Enoch, had been transmuted into this Hermes. Chepiton metamexuchon, what they will transmute into. We subscribe to the opinion of those who mention that Hermes reached the age of 190 years, for it is on this basis, whether we say he was born before or after Abraham. We shall always, however, demonstrate remarkable consonance of their deeds with the times assigned them. Iamblichus, in his book on the mysteries of the Egyptians, reports that this Mercury Trismegistus was the author and prince not only of philosophy, but also of all Egyptian wisdom, which he also handed down in the Egyptian language. He produced the testimony of the ancient authors Seleucus and Manetho, who each asserted that he wrote all about the wisdom of the Egyptians in their language. Some 36,529 books, of which in particular 100 books are listed about the Empyrean gods, and 100 about the ethereal gods, 1,000 about the celestial gods, most of which were translated from the Egyptian language into Greek by men not so well versed in philosophy. Clement VI writes in the Stromata that in his time the following books existed among the Egyptians. That is, about the universal philosophy of the Egyptians, 36 books. About medicine, 6 books. About the priesthood, 10. And about astrology, 4. However, I should not like anyone to think at this point that Trismegistus actually wrote some 36,000 complete volumes. By such terms, books are properly meant hieroglyphic systems, that is, nichom in the Egyptian language, that is, certain hieroglyphic systems by which he described various arts and sciences, as will be shown elsewhere in the course of this work. This nichom is sometimes taken to mean scientific conclusions, theses, or opinions proposed on a subject. And that is how these 36,000 books are to be taken. Of which then, from the more select propositions or theses, some have given more extensive material treatment, which have been placed in the ancient commentaries. Hence, it is also clear that it is false to say that the Egyptians before Moses had no other writings than hieroglyphics, for, as we have shown, it was the unanimous opinion of all Orientals, nay, tradition, that Trismegistus wrote the books we have cited on papyrus, in the common language, that is, Egyptian, and also to have inscribed the more secret or hidden ones onto columns. But since we have already shown Trismegistus lived in a time before Moses, it is certain that Moses was imbued with the entire wisdom of the Egyptians, handed down by the same Trismegistus. It is certainly so certain that he both wrote and engraved them onto stone, that no one should have any longer doubt. For he himself testifies to this in the sacred book, where Grandfather Hermes is quoted as saying, "These arcana," says Hermes, "will recognize and discern the secrets of all my writings, and some will contain themselves. But those that tend to the benefit of mortals, that is, those that are wisely established with the help of the genii to avoid evil and acquire good things, they will engrave on columns and obelisks." And in the same book cited, he speaks thus of his own books. I have to read the Latin and not the Greek, sorry. "O sacred books of incorruptible things, which have received from me a gift worse than the medicine of incorruption, unfading throughout time, and incorruptible, permanently invisible, and undetected by anyone who has transgressed this discipline." With these words, he hints that the matter about which the books treat is so sublime that no one can grasp it with his intellect unless he has meticulously observed the precepts of life handed down in the sacred text. And from these, perhaps more extensively than was proper, it is clearly evident that after the flood all the divine, human, political, lawful, and unlawful sciences were disseminated far and wide among the descendants of Noah, both through Ham and Hermes, and their followers and disciples, and that the mechanical arts especially flourished among the Egyptians at that time. So much so that they were not content with building numerous cities, but also vast and sumptuous masses of structures to testify to the posterity the greatness of the deeds they accomplished, as in the Tower of Babylon, which is expressly mentioned in the following book, and after the tower, the stupendous and prodigious structures of Ninus and Semiramis. Then also in Egypt, the pyramids and other structures erected by the descendants of Ham, monuments exceeding human belief. Abundantly they testify. But whoever desires more minute and exact details on these things, let him go inspect our hieroglyphic works, the Egyptian Oedipus and the Pamphylian obelisk, where he will behold with admiration the most subtle talent of primitive men after the flood for inventing new things, as well as the incredible greatness of their minds in carrying out those things they invented. But, having already stated these things, let us now proceed to the next division, in the next chapter, to the division of the world, which Noah distributed to his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, Japheth, and to their sons' sons.